What's up, everybody? Welcome to the State of Wild, episode 121, a regular YouTube video web series podcast thingy. My name is Meowth, and as usual, I'm joined by my two good friends and co-host Roffle and Corbett. Guys, how you guys doing this week?
Doing all right. It's been a while since we've had much news in terms of like Wild Hearthstone in particular, but we did have a fantastic Vicious Syndicate meta report come out that the two of you worked very hard on. So we have a better, more objective look at the Wild metagame now, and can kind of get a better sense of like what's going on with the format.
Yeah, I always like the whenever we get a VS report, it feels like a little bit of the Obama meme where I'm kind of like giving myself the medal. But as just a consumer of all the information, I'm a big fan. I feel like it definitely helps me get a much more concrete grasp on what's really going on in the format, not just for what I'm playing against, but what the entire player base is seeing as well, which is very important.
Yeah, I think the most value that I get out of this is I know my experience at like top 200 legend. And I get a glimpse of what Roffle experiences, but this kind of gives a picture for what the majority of the player base is experiencing, which is always super interesting. So yeah, today we're gonna kind of dive into some of the details of this VS report. I'll drop a link down in the comments and the description so that you guys can always just check this out if you guys want to on your own if you haven't already. But story time. I know like a month ago when Renathal got nerfed, a bunch of people in the Wild format, including us, we're a little bit doomer status. Oh my god, Renathal is going to get nerfed. It's going to be all aggro, and control decks are dead. They're just not going to exist anymore. I know those were some reactions. And I'm not going to lie to you, for maybe the majority of the player base from Diamond to Legend, kind of maybe seems like that is the case, right? If you look at 5 or 6 of the most popular decks in the format, or the strongest decks in the format, rather, they all do look like they are these aggressive decks, right? Championed by, the holy trinity of even Shaman, Pirate Rogue, and Secret Mage. Probably decks that, if you're climbing to Legend, you're probably sick of seeing already at this point.
I can assure you that I am sick of seeing them. Yeah, and I am at Legend. Although because of how far down I've tanked my MMR, I'm not queuing against Legend opponents necessarily. But that was another instance of maybe Meowth this time placing a medal on over his own shoulders. We predicted this, but at the same time, it was fairly predictable, right? Like if you remove Renathal, the thing that's stopping aggro from taking over the format, aggro is going to take over the format. So like, yeah, it's aggro, and then decks that beat aggro, which are also just aggro themselves. They're just different aggro than the aggro that you're aggroing against most of the games. So yeah, things are quite aggressive in the format, and you really have to scroll down to the bottom to start seeing things like controlled Death Knight with the blood runes, and anything with the word Reno in it is mostly disappeared or just sunk down to the bottom of the list.
Yeah, it really seems like the predictions that we kind of had have turned into reality. I will say that I think Wild specifically, and we get into this in the report, has been very reluctant to give up their prized Renathal, which may make some of these Reno decks look a little bit worse than they otherwise potentially would be. But yeah, in some ways, like the format is kind of unraveled as anticipated, but there have also been counters that have popped up that have sort of stopped a few decks from kind of running away to tier S status. I think even Shaman looked like it was a very big risk of kind of just having 0 counters at all. But it turns out things like Shudderwock are still very good, and then things like even Warlock have really made a resurgence, and even Miracle Rogue hasn't gone away entirely. So the format is probably not going exactly how we expected, even though it's kind of trending in that direction.
Yeah, let's focus first from like the Diamond 4 to Legend bracket here, right? Kind of the big meta breaker is Unholy Even Death Knight. The deck that we were hyping up at the very beginning, when we were theory crafting, we knew this was going to be busted. Yeah.
No, you don't get to take this one.
It's a collective we for the podcast. I'm
I think
counting
Corb and I
this.
were championing that one.
I was skeptical.
You were.
It looks
I think
good.
I think some of your skepticism, though, to be fair, was just like you trying to get us on track and evaluate cards outside of like being included with Gen. So like that's your job as like the host of the podcast, I guess. But so I think that maybe I'm being a little bit unfair to you. But yeah, like we predicted this and then we were wrong out of the gate because discard Warlock existed and no decks really got to exist in that world. Other than maybe Pillager. And then we're still wrong for a while because the deck needed some refinement. And I think it needed two things. I think it needed the refinement that, maybe we didn't see going into it. It started when people started moving the infused cards in. It started looking pretty good, though. And then I think it also just really needed the current metagame is a big part of it, right? Like it's, it does... Unlike some of the other aggressive decks in the format, it really does not want to queue into slow control decks. Like it's not the thing pushing those slow control decks out of the metagame. It's like contesting some of those other fast decks and doing a better job of like gripping and staying on the board.
Yeah, and Roffle, we were obviously very, very hyped on Death Knight, like you said, but then, yeah, we were kind of just completely wrong. But it was mostly just because the Disco Warlock meta in general kind of choked out every aggressive deck in the format, and obviously even Death Knight is the deck that needs there to be other aggressive decks in the format. So it wasn't really a surprise there. But yeah, the results were not super shocking for me because I neurotically check the HS replay things. But I imagine for the majority of the player base, this was probably a little bit of a surprise. I saw like pretty heavy reactions. I think that this was the big kind of the shock factor from the VS report, like something that you weren't seeing in other tier lists and things like that. But it kind of makes sense, like when you start looking at the popularity of these aggressive decks at certain rank brackets, why this was performing so well.
I think it's important to touch on a little bit of why I think Death Knight is doing so well, right? We talk about its matchups into these other aggressive decks, right? It farms Pirate Rogue, like it is a very good matchup into Pirate Rogue while being able to hold its own against like even Shaman and Secret Mage, which I think are very, very important when those are like the three most popular decks from Diamond to Legend. And so a deck that kind of holds its own and actually farms a specific matchup like Pirate Rogue is going to mean that even Death Knight is going to perform well.
Yeah, like even Death Knight and Pirate Rogue are kind of the barometers of the format. They're kind of the things that are largely dictating performance. They make up about 30% of the meta at top 1K. And so, like that population alone is able to heavily influence the performance of decks like not just even Death Knight, but, in the opposite direction, things like Pillager Rogue, which previously looked really good. And now all of a sudden the meta's like very aggressive. And now that deck looks, trash would be a nice way of putting it.
It's back where it belongs, right? We were giving it a hype the last time we did a VS report, putting it up like, oh, it's the best it's ever looked. It's creeping up into like tier 2 status. And now it's back where it belongs, down there in tier 4, which is nice.
And for what it's worth, I heard some people speculating like, oh, maybe like Pillager Rogue, there are more people playing it, so they're all just like playing it trash. Like they're all bad at it. Like back when it was a specialty, that's why it was good. I actually looked through like all the matchups and compared them to the previous report. Like they didn't really change at all. It's not the matchups didn't change. It's the meta that changed, and that's the thing that's causing the difference.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting look at two decks that are very meta dependent, having like an inverse response to a change in the meta game, right? Because even there wasn't a VS report, but even when Disco Lock was so prevalent, like we talked recently about Pillager being a potential second deck in the format when Disco Lock was there, and now that's kind of completely flipped. We talked like how Death Knight needed the current metagame in order to be relevant, or at least the even Death Knight needed to be the current metagame to be relevant at all. That's kind of interesting how small changes to a handful of decks can have this like cascading effect. And really, I guess one deck in like the banning of tone tampering is probably a more consequential change than like the Renethal nerf overall in terms of like the grip a single deck has on the format. One interesting thing that I don't know if you guys have experience in this much yet is like Unholy Death Knight is the primary build of the even deck. And I think that's maybe some people's surprise as well because Unholy seems to be so terrible in Standard. But it's how people initially built even Death Knight in Wild, but it almost seems like the runes that you choose are not terribly consequential. I had a lot of success with a full frost rune, taking advantage of the 6 drops to like burst down with Marrow Manipulator and Overseer Frigidara. And recently there's been a double blood single unholy list that I've seen popping up a little bit that like does some hand buffy things. I think the unholy with Marigar at your top end is probably the best thing still, with maybe that frost being a second place, and we'll see about the blood. But like it's interesting how reliant the deck is on neutral cards and generating cards, or just like creating boards with the neutral undead synergies that it's mostly just like hero power plus a handful of neutral cards that are good, and then fill in whatever with runed cards.
Yeah, it seems like it's very much what do you want your payoff to be for like the unholy. It's the grave strengths, the Marigars, and then access to stuff like Plague Strike. And then for the frost, I think it's the 6 drops. The 6 drops are insane. And then like the access to what is it called, defrost, the 2-mana draw 2, right? And I haven't really seen much of the. I've seen talk about the frost one. I'm a little like hesitant to believe in it because I haven't actually played it myself. And this is the first time I'm hearing about the 2 blood unholy, but like I don't know, dude. If you got the Gen hero power, I think the reason that a lot of people are like, I don't know, excited that it's like a real deck is because it plays very much like what people want of old Wild, right? Like it reminds people, I think, a lot of like the odd paladin and odd rogue days of Witchwood and maybe like even paladin of some just nice fair Hearthstone that you're playing, which is kind of unusual for Wild, but when it works, I think people enjoy it.
Yeah, it's a very even paladin-y deck when you get down to it. And it has things like School Teacher that allow you to generate some value still. Yeah, like it like superficially it seems like it plays fair, and then it just kind of keeps winning.
All right. Let's talk about a couple of other decks that, despite nerfs, are still kind of showing up and doing surprisingly well. So I think the first one that we have to talk about is Miracle Rogue, and this is popping up, especially at higher legend. And I think this is a lot of deck, myself included, had kind of written off with the Sinstone Graveyard nerf and the Draka nerf. But turns out Rogue is busted and is still doing broken things, even with 2 of its best cards nerfed. So Corb, you're the Miracle Rogue guy, and we're just going to kind of let you take it away with this. Why is Miracle Rogue still so damn good?
Oh, because it cheats mana, Mia. Because it cheats mana. That's the big thing. Yeah, I've been really. I feel personally responsible for this. I feel like I'm championing Miracle Rogue. I kind of helped get some builds popularized in HS Replay, and then the Maestra build that kind of took over, that didn't even like pop into the VS report. Like that's something that kind of started popping up in the week leading up to the actual report being written itself, but wasn't in the initial like data collection period. And that deck looks really good. So basically, like Miracle Rogue is just so well-rounded and so good into a lot of these aggressive matchups. It scales really well in terms of like the skill cap. It continues to just get better and better because it is quite difficult to pilot compared to the average deck in Wild. But its ability to sort of like have these dramatic board swings, you know, with the Serrated, the Rush cards, and then just pump out a shit ton of stats. It's a very strong strategy in Wild. You know, like not every deck can answer a 12/12 Edwin on turn 3 and things like that. So the combination of draw, mana cheat, removal, like it's just very well suited to the format. Like if you took if you took Miracle Rogue, right, and you didn't nerf it initially and you just subtracted Renathal from the format, like it would have elevated to tier S like instantly. If you didn't make these other changes. So it's not really a shocker where like Renathal removing some of the better counters, some of the better things like Curse Warlock and Warlocks in general, like Reno Warlock, Reno Priest, those kind of being mitigated in the format is a huge positive for Miracle. And it's kind of left where there's only like 1 or 2 counters. It's kind of the Shudderwock Shaman, and then Maybe like Pillager if the Miracle's not playing Lothar, but that's kind of about it. So yeah, I mean, just super good deck.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the skill cap associated with it, but I don't think there's a more clear example of this where it legitimately goes from tier 3 at Diamond 1 to, or Diamond 4 to 1 to tier 2 at across all ranks in Legend to tier 1 at High Legend. Like, so I don't think there's better evidence for that. Some of that is, at lower ranks, people might be playing some of the decks that have been pushed out a little bit more frequently to beat that, but like that doesn't account for all of it. And yeah, like when I started seeing it pop up again in standard and it's kind of got a chokehold there, I was like, oh, maybe that's maybe that's going to filter through to wild, because I think it was a pretty underrated deck. Even prior to the nerfs, I don't think that a lot of people down ladder saw it as frequently or saw it as a real threat to the format. Partially because of people weren't playing it as frequently because of the skill cap issue, but also like you said, the matchups weren't there. It feels really bad to lose with the deck to like a Reno deck, for instance. But now that those are gone or less prevalent, it's a little bit easier to escape. But like I really think Corb can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Sinstone was much more damaging to the deck than the Draka. I feel like when I was playing the deck a lot, Draka felt like close to just not often being as relevant, just because it's like a turn or two slower than like an Edwin, for instance. Like you can just get him with an old Edwin and be happy about that. Whereas Draka, while bursty, still cost 4 mana, and that's a lot of mana in the deck.
Yeah, so the thing about Draka was that it certainly helped like well round your matchups where Draka was particularly effective against things like Shudderwock and the Reno decks and like the Renathal decks, because if your board is removed, you kind of need that off-board damage and things like that. But yeah, Sinstone was definitely sort of the main payoff initially. That's why Draka's gone. Sinstone at 3 it's very good in standard. In Wild, it's actually like a little bit less so, and it's probably just because we have Edwin. Like, we already have, like, a much better payoff to those early pop-off turns. So it's not as important that you get the Sinstone early. But, it is definitely a big part of the success, being able to pump out, like, an 11/11 minion on turn 4 or turn 5. So, it survived the nerfs so well, like, way easier than I expected. Like, I thought this deck was dead. A lot of people thought this deck was dead. Like Roffle said, popped up in Standard. Ooh, maybe it's good in Wild. Ooh, there's a Maestro version in Standard. I wonder if we could play that in Wild. and here we are today.
Yeah, the core philosophy of deck building: take the standard deck, port it to Wild, easy Legend. Yeah,
it's a good approach. All right, if something's broken in Standard, it's probably playable in Wild, and that has been my philosophy for literally years now. And I feel like it has like a great success rate for deck building.
Yeah, the corollary to that though is that if it's broken in Standard, it's probably getting nerfed.
Oh yeah,
whether or not it's broken in Wild. so enjoy it while you can.
Yeah, I think you mentioned, Corb, that it was probably going to be the Knolls that get hit again for like the 4th time. If they are to nerf something in Miracle Rogue, they just need to rework that card or just rotate it early or whatever, because I feel like that card has been a problem for 2 years now. But yeah, I'm a little bit curious to see what they do, because I know like concoctions are also like super popular in Standard, right? Like in that Miracle Rogue build. You don't think there's any world where they're like nerfing Putricide or something like that instead?
I think that would be surprising. I think the concoctions are very strong, but they're not power outliers in the same way that some of the other payoffs right now in Rogue are. Like people get confused where they see Potion Belt looks broken in Miracle Rogue, and they say, "Oh, this card is insane." I'm like, no, this card's insane because it discounts Null by 3. Like, if we don't play Null, then it doesn't actually, like, it's not actually that good. Like, it's fine, but it's not that special. So, I think that the things that are going to be changed in Miracle Rogue, they're going to go after Null. I think that's, like, a certainty. Astalor getting, I think, put to 3 mana is something that affects Rogue actually quite a lot, because there's a lot of Shadow Step Astalor abuse going on, and if that costs mana instead of costing 0, then, yeah, it's not as good. And so it'll be much more... it'll be a lot easier for some of the slow matchups to handle Miracle Rogue if they don't have to deal with triple Astalor as consistently. And there's probably a chance that like the ghosts have a change as well, whether it's like maybe like they lose stealth, right? Like that could be something that happens as well. So we'll have to wait and see. There'll be a patch next week. Not guaranteeing that. No, don't hold me to it, but there'll be a patch next week.
It's too late. You've said it. People are going to hold you to it.
Yeah, that's expectations have already been set.
You didn't learn your lesson, Corp, from all these other episodes. Come on, what are you doing?
Hey, last time I did this, I was right though. I called my shot on the mini set, and it was bang on. I think.
I know, but the play is to be
always undersell.
Skeptical, and then just be happy being wrong. That's what I go with.
Yeah. All right. So Miracle Rogue is a deck. If you have put off playing the deck because you saw it get nerfed and you just didn't want to play it anymore, turns out deck is still good. Play it before it gets nerfed again. The lists are all in the report here. You guys can check that out. Another deck that has you mentioned already kind of come back from the dead is even Warlock, right? And I wonder how much of that. I think the majority of that is kind of the same thing that we were talking about with stuff like even Death Knight and Miracle Rogue, where the Reno deck seemed to have completely disappeared from the format, where there's a whole lot of aggro, and then you've got this even Warlock deck with Molten Giants and Soul Rends and Defiles that tend to do pretty good in these matchups. And so it looks like that's kind of the big reason that even Warlock seems to be back.
Yeah, definitely. Players are kind of just searching for responses to some of the aggro decks. Like, high legend players in particular don't want to play aggro. Like, they just don't want to play aggro. They'll do anything to avoid playing aggro. Like, unless the deck is completely busted, then they might consider playing it. And so there's been kind of like a looking around for answers to things like even Shaman. And even Warlock is a great answer to that. It's one of the only decks in the format that can boast like a positive win rate against even Shaman. And it kind of has the bonus where it's not even that bad in the Miracle Rogue, because you can always tech in, Arson Accusation, Cult Neophyte and Rats are also very effective. And, 8/8s are good as well. So even Warlock has just a small secret mage problem, which, depending on what rank you're in, that might not be so small. Which is, funnily enough, the same thing that Shudderwock has, where these two decks are very good answers to even Shaman, but in a lot of ways, Secret Mage and even Shaman protect each other. Where Secret Mage keeps away the big bad, like even Warlock and Shaman, and then even Shaman keeps away some of the other aggressive decks that would bully Secret Mage. So together they kind of have a little bit of a balancing act where it makes it very hard to target both of them at the same time, and maybe outside Miracle Rogue, it's kind of like almost impossible.
Yeah, so what you're saying, I think, is that even Death Knight is the savior that we needed to kind of break up some of that, because it's not great into either of those, but it has game into each. I guess in hindsight, it's not terribly surprising to see even Lock come back into vogue with so much aggro, because that's, aside from Secret Mage, historically what it's excelled against. Because there's not much stronger in card games than clearing an opponent's wide board and then on the same turn developing your own big board to get them the next turn. And so that's what even Lock excels at, and it really wants a metagame that plays for board. And very much like you mentioned Miracle Rogue, it very much does not want a metagame where Zeph into Shadow Word Ruin is common, and that's pretty devastating for it. Priest removal in general is just crippling for even Lock. And aside from Shadow Priest, or aggro Shadow Priest specifically, Reno, the slower Priest decks have just fallen off of the face of the metagame. It's a little bit more surprising to see Shudderwock still be so prevalent into this type of metagame, but they do have their own ways to slow down the metagame, or slow down what the opponent is doing with things like Devolve and Flurgle Talks, as well as accelerate their own game plan with the bit strong Murloc package of Clownfish into Gorlock into your board's gone and look at my board now. So it kind of does the same thing that the Evenlock does if you consider that Murloc package a little bit.
Yeah, so let's continue kind of on that point of Shudderwock Shaman. So when we talked about Renathal being nerfed, we talked about the demise of all these Reno decks and kind of just control decks in general, but it looks like Shudderwock is kind of the deck so far that has adapted to a Renathal list 30, because it seems like everybody that's playing Reno still wants to play Renathal. Makes sense, right? It is wild, decks of old. It's a little bit more of a casual format. It makes sense, but it does look like people have very quickly hopped onto the 30 card Shudderwock train, um, it's doing very well, right? Corby mentioned the really good matchup in stuff like Even Shaman, which at High Legend is like 15% of the meta. So if you have a good matchup into that, it's a very good thing for your deck. But it also like very good into stuff like Miracle Rogue. It stands a chance against combo. That's something that I've always kind of said about Shudderwock Shaman or Free Shaman, is that it tends to have game against most everything in the format, which is why I think it's pretty appealing to a lot of people, and also kind of why it's doing so well, right? Like it doesn't have any 70-30s, but it's like it's good into a lot of the stuff in the format without losing a ton of percentage points otherwise.
Yeah, there's like a handful of decks like this, and this is kind of like the best example of the slower deck that is like good into everything. It's not like completely broken or anything. Like it's just a good deck right now, but it's become particularly popular at top ranks like very recently with the rise of Miracle Rogue. Shudderwock Shaman might actually be the most popular deck at top ranks, I would say. And that is just a response to the fact that, again, players don't really want to play Secret Mage and things like that at top ranks, and they do want to play Miracle Rogue, and people want to have a chance against everything. So Shudderwock has done a really good job adjusting. Players have mostly swung around to like this full Murloc package, which is funny because this wasn't the case pre-Renathal. Like pre-Renathal, players weren't doing this, and I think it kind of took the Renathal deck and fitting the full Murlocs in that. And then we go back to 30 cards and players say, no, I actually kind of liked that massive board swing that I was doing on turn 5. Like, what if we just keep that in? And so, people have moved away from things like Primal Dungeoneer. It's like, who needs card draw when I have, like, Murlocs to draw, But at the same time, the non, full Murloc version is also very good. It's not as good, it seems like, but very good. Like, there's not that much of a drop-off. So if you want to play just, like, the Flurgle Tox and maybe a Mutinous, like, whatever, you just want to play, like, Flurgle Tox and do that, and you want to have like Polkelt and have it a bit more geared towards the Shudderwock, great, you can do that if that's the thing that you like. And if you want to play like full Murlocs, then that's also quite fun. Something I will recommend that not everyone is doing that isn't that common on ladder is playing Rotgill in your Murloc Shaman, because that card for 1 mana with a full board of Murlocs is it kind of just GG's. Like there's no real coming back from that one. So that might be something that becomes a bit more popular over the next coming weeks, I think.
Yeah, I was playing a Galakron version of Shudderwock Shaman recently, and Rotgill won me far more games than Shudderwock, or than both Shudderwock and Galakron. Like it was just it was the thing that won me games like a lot of the time, because like you said, coming down at 1 mana, it's a very different card. I think one thing we would be remiss to not mention would be that like the inclusion of Astalor also gives the deck a lot of the lethality that it's been missing. Both with the Denathrius nerf, it was trying to fill that gap, or prior to the Denathrius nerf, it was trying to fill that gap with the Denathrius. But basically, the lethality that it lost with the Snowfall Guardian nerf is just come right back with a single card in Astalor that is like doing several other things as well that the deck wants to do, and then also generating more damage. So like, yeah, you don't really care too much about going infinite. Really, you just like win the game with Astalors, and like that closes it out while locking your opponent out. So you don't need to like deal with pesky boards or like bashing your opponent that way. It's like Astalor is a really big deal.
Yeah, there's no need to freeze the board with Snowfall Guardians when Astalor is clearing it anyways, and then also giving you 3 more Astalors. So yeah, in case you guys couldn't tell, play the Astalors while you can, because that card seems like it's about to get nerfed whenever we get our balance patch next. I think very obviously it's going to get nerfed. I think it's like 70% of decks in Standard, which is insane, because that's way more than even Renathal was, it, right?
Yeah. It's not even close. It's like Renathal was like 50%. Yeah, this is a pretty disturbing number.
Yeah, this card's getting nerfed. I don't know how they're going to nerf it. We're not card designers, but that card's getting nerfed, and it's seeing play in a ton of wild decks. Something we haven't talked about. Astalor is seeing play in the Even Unholy Death Knight, and it's one of the best cards in that deck. It is seeing play in Even Shaman. Low key, maybe you're supposed to be playing it in Secret Mage as well. Like, the card should be seeing play in most of your decks, unless you have a very good reason not to.
Yeah. Something just like before I move on about the Even Death Knight. I forgot to mention this before. This deck has actually like surged like hugely at Diamond. I know in the report it's like a very fringe thing, but if you actually check like the last 7 days, it kind of looks like it's in about like 8 to 9% of decks, which at like Diamond, which is about the same population as things like Big Priest and things like even Shaman. Kind of only like Secret Mage clears it. So it seems like this has already been like dramatically changing the landscape of like the Diamond player base. And because it is like such a brutal matchup and things like Pirate Rogue, it wouldn't shock me if like this deck going up by like, you know, like 5, 6, 7% by itself is enough to maybe drop down Pirate Rogue by a tier, like a percent or two. So just something I figured I'd add on. Well, you mentioned even Death Knight.
Yeah. Okay. One last deck that I do want to talk about. So Discard Warlock. We talked about the Tome Tampering ban, and it seems like Discard Warlock is still a thing even without Tome Tampering. I think there's been a kind of divide into two different versions of the deck. So there's like still the aggro Discard Warlock, right? That does the things with Silverware Golem and Boneweb Egg and what is the 2/5 taunt, Walking Dead, and Wicked Whispers, and it does like the aggro game plan with Soulfires and all that kind of good stuff. And then there also looks like there's a kind of a pure combo deck. I think is the best way to describe it, where you're not playing any Hand Gul'dans, and you are just playing Expired Merchants with Soul Barrages, and then Grave Defilers with Fist of Jaraxxus. So the whole idea of the deck is to, you know, load up your hand with a bunch of these Soul Barrages and Fists, and then you play, what is the card called? Talented Arcanist, the one that gives your next spell plus 2 spell damage, and then you Cataclysm, and you dome the opponent for like 40 damage. And you can do that pretty consistently on like turn 5, turn 6, turn 7, if you're kind of undisturbed. And so there's kind of been this divide. The VS report doesn't really distinguish, I think, very clearly between the two lists. But it does look like Discard Warlock, despite eating a ban, a very relevant ban, looks like it's still kicking, looks like it's still got a lot of momentum with these two different builds.
I mean, you say that, but it's like not performing nearly on the same stratosphere as where it was.
It's still 50%, right? 50% win rate after eating a Tome Tampering ban, which I think is relevant, right? Like it's still in the same win rate bracket as like Big Priest and stuff like that, which is important to note.
It's still a deck. Like it didn't get like completely nerfed out of oblivion, just like, or out of viability. Just it's not quite what it was. You know, yeah, like we talked about it. Cataclysm is still a card, so you can still get that bulk discard. It's just like it misses that redundancy. I think with the Tome Tampering, as well as the longevity that it has, which is less relevant now because it's like mostly looking at aggro mirrors. But like, you know, ripping a on curve Cataclysm that also develops your board seems like it would be pretty strong into, you know, a lot of the decks that we've talked about being in that tier 1 category right now. Whether or not you have a Soul Barrage to like have that immediate burst damage is not as important as maybe like the Walking Deads and the Silverware Golems for that those types of matchups. And so I could see it being very like rank dependent on what you're queuing into in terms of which is the better version, because you probably want the board development into other board based decks, because like free minions are going to win you the board quite often, whereas like against things like maybe a Miracle Rogue or a Shudderwock Shaman, like we talked about, or even like potentially even lock, because you're probably not going to win the board clearing matchup, you might be better off with the combo-y version. I don't know. I'm still kind of skeptical of the combo-y version, just because it feels like a lot of things need to like line up nicely for that to work out. Basically, you need to be undisturbed for the early turns, but there's a lot of decks that tend to disturb you in the early turns right now, at least at the ranks that I play at. So yeah, it's better than I thought, but like not anywhere near where it was, so that's a good thing.
With both versions of Disco Warlock, they both look similar. Like it's not really clear which one is distinctly better, but yeah, they're good decks. Like the Disco Warlock stuff, you know, like they're not absolutely competing right now with the best decks in the format, but like that said, they're like around a 50% win rate. They're not that much further behind like even Warlock and Shudderwock Shaman, things like that. And so Yeah, pretty resilient so far. Like the most interesting thing that I found when like kind of like looking at the Disco Warlock stuff was that it doesn't have a single matchup below 40% at any rank bracket. And that's a secret mage, and like almost every other matchup is like 44 or higher. And we talked about this in the report, but it basically alludes to or this like puts to light just how difficult it was to find counters when this deck was like just a little bit better, because it kind of is flat. Like it just beats, like it has the ability to beat everything. Basically, like it combos fast and it could swing the board and things like that. And so this is definitely like a potential danger scenario moving forward. Like we've already kind of like looked at the danger scenario, but it's very reminiscent of Darkest Hour in some ways. I think those are two that have a comparison where like there was a time when Darkest Hour was really kind of shitty, but because it was like 47-53 into everything, and then it was kind of like, okay, so that's not too bad. But what if it gets a little bit better into everything? And then it did. And then it did get like a bit better into everything, and then it had no counter. It was kind of like a hellhole. But yeah, Disco Warlock, very impressive so far, I think, considering that it's not refined. Like, it hasn't been getting very much attention. Builds are all over the place. Like, nobody knew where to net deck, and like nobody knew what to replace Tome Tampering with. And so it wouldn't shock me again if we keep on seeing this deck get better and better over time, and even probably not creep up right into that like even Shaman range, but you know, like I wouldn't be shocked if it keeps on getting stronger and becomes a more powerful player in the format moving forward.
You feel like you triggered Roffle's PTSD with mentioning of Darkest Hour. I'm sorry, dude.
you did, but do we know if like the Talented Arcanist with the Cataclysm interaction is intended as it stands right now? Because it seems like counterintuitive both with like how the words on the cards read, and also like with the Garrote interaction that was fixed previously, which I know is slightly different, but like it doesn't seem like that isn't intended.
But I have had this debate many times with Twitch chat so far.
Right. There's no agreement.
The thing is, like, Cataclysm doesn't quite do what you think it does, because if it did, then you wouldn't draw cards with Malkamp, right? Because like if the minions died and then the discard effect kind of happens, then that wouldn't make sense. Like the minion would be dead, you wouldn't draw. So it's kind of like a simultaneous action thing. But apart from that, I think the way Arcanist is basically working is that it keeps the spell damage until the spell that you're using resolves. Like until that card is fully resolved. So until that end effect happens where all the discards effect go through and everything, Cataclysm isn't resolved, and so like it maintains that spell damage the entire way. So that's the way that I'm interpreting it. I don't think it's a bug. I think this is just unintuitive. Twitch chat has assured me that it is abusing things, and I don't think it is. I think it's just a little bit confusing because of the way Cataclysm works. Yeah. But I think that's how Arcanist is intended to be. Like intended.
It's also
work.
I think it's also important to note that it doesn't give like the spell damage property to like the spells in your hand. It's like an aura for you that says like whenever you cast your next spell, it has like +2 spell damage. And so you kind of just like have this aura on you until you resolve your next spell that turn, which is why like the Cataclysm as part of its like resolution is like triggering all of these effects. And so you still have that spell damage until that Cataclysm resolves. And it makes sense to me if you think about it like that. The weird thing is the way that they changed Garrote, right? Like that's the part that's a little confusing to me. With what this is intended or not.
Right. It makes sense that like from that perspective, but like you give the spell damage to the Cataclysm, why do it reads your next spell this turn has +2 spell damage, right? So the Cataclysm is the spell that gets +2 spell damage, but like why is it then still giving +2 spell damage to the spells in hand, right? Because like it's already chosen Cataclysm as the card with +2 spell damage. That's the part that's
I think it doesn't see that you've chosen Cataclysm though until the Cataclysm resolves. Right.
So yeah, it's a weird timing thing. There's no, I think, correct answer to that until we get a dev response in terms of what is intended. You're talking about arguments with Twitch chat. I was assured that it's not intended, but it's also not a bug. And this was a message from the same person.
Big
Which,
one.
right. So I didn't know how to respond to that, but I was on the side that, like, to me, it felt like a bug just because of, again, the precedent with Groat. Nobody's going to get banned, I would assume, for abusing it, but like,
No.
because like we've already had that conversation, and especially in the format of Wild, like it's not going to happen. Uh, but I don't know. I still, even with that explanation, I understand it,
Mhm.
but I still don't think that that's how it's meant to work.
Yeah, I think it's just a little bit of a disconnect to how the card is worded and how it actually functions with
Mhm.
like the battle cry. Your next spell this turn has spell damage +2, and what it's kind of saying is like you have +2 spell damage until your next spell is cast. It's sort of like how it practically works. And so that's kind of where I think the confusion lies, because it is weird, but I don't know. I don't know if it's meant to be like it can be thought of as a bug or not, and we haven't gotten any comment on it from
Right.
any devs or anything. So I don't know. I think it's a bit unclear.
I think so too. And I don't I don't think it's going to be a high priority fix regardless of whether or not it's, or if it's
Yeah.
unintended anyway, just because the deck's not super oppressive and it's the Wild format. So
You said the words.
yeah.
All right. I said Disco Warlock was going to be my last deck, but I do kind of want to close on one last note here, and that is the Reno decks. And so, if you look at the VS report, they all look like trash, and that's putting it nicely. They all are very poor win rates. We do allude to this a little bit in there, and I kind of want to just bring it up to you guys to discuss and to convince the people that are listening to stop playing Renathal in their Reno decks. And it looks like the performance is probably going to be better. And I know it's Wild. I know people want to play what they want to, and like, if that's your goal, so be it, right? But if you also, want to try to maximize the win rates of your Reno decks, I think the goal of me saying this is that I think Reno decks are better than what they look like if you're playing like a 30 card list.
Yeah, almost undoubtedly they're going to be better as a 30 card list, but I don't think that accounts for the sharp decline that we saw. I think it's more matchup dependent. So like that doesn't mean everything. You are going to lose maybe a percentage or two by including Renathal in your deck, like overall win rate probably, and especially in certain matchups. But I think that there's also just like there's a portion of the player base that you are not going to convince to take Renathal out of your deck regardless of how bad it is. So like I think especially, and there's a large, I think, overlap of that audience that will put Renathal in any deck with the player base that will play Reno in any metagame regardless of how bad it is, comparatively or compared to the other decks. So I think that like that's just how Reno decks are going to be moving forward. They've often always just kind of devolved into a pile of cards when like they aren't performing well, and now they just get to be a bigger pile of cards with Renathal in the deck.
Yeah. I like definitely think that like the decks will generally be performing better. There might be an exception or two, but even then, like I think a deck like Pain Warlock can get away with Renathal. But again, like the Renathal deck's probably not so much. So the Reno deck's not so much. Something as well that we have to remember is that it wasn't just like the Renathal change. It was kind of like, hey guys, remember Theater? Like that. Like remember that because that got changed with the expansion launch, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of I think has slipped by people because we went through the whole disco mania, and then by the time like the band came in, they also had Renathal change, so it was like a 2-for-1. The Reno decks no longer have a really strong Theater as well,
and no longer have
yeah,
Denathrius, and
no, yeah,
soon they're not going to have Astalor.
It's kind of multiple things going on, and is it a shocker like that Reno decks are not good right now? No, like we've largely, again, we've talked about this. We've largely reverted back to a Voyage in the Sunken City meta. And guess what, guys? There were not Reno decks in that meta. Like if you want to play slow stuff, it was even Warlock and Shudderwock Shaman. Coincidence? What's good right now? Even Warlock and Shudderwock Shaman. And so I just think, like Roffle said, the drop isn't just Renathal.
Yeah.
The drop is just like it's a lot, and these decks are just not
Yeah, I guess the whole point of me bringing this up though was that yes, they look like tier 4, right? Post Renathal nerf, but I think they're a lot better than what they are looking like. I think I've had a lot
I
of
don't.
success
I
with
would.
Reno Mage and Reno Lock. I know that's my personal bias and sample, but I think there's actually something like, especially if you're in that diamond bracket where you're queuing into all these aggro decks and even Death Knight and things like that. I actually think that like a Reno Warlock or a Reno Mage are actually very good. You know, I just don't know how many people are willing to, do the work, find a 30 card list. Because if you're playing the Reno deck, you're playing it because you enjoy it, right? Like, and you want to enjoy that experience. And I think a lot of people, that's now tied to Renathal, like you guys have mentioned. But I don't know, you may have skepticism about it just like being good in general, is what it sounded like.
Yeah, I think that the counterpoint to that is that Shudderwock was a Renathal deck prior to this, and probably still has a relatively high proportion of people that are running Renathal in their Shudderwock deck, but that deck is still performing well, and in spite of that. Whereas, like, I think that if Reno Lock and Reno Priest, which are the only two really things that pop up, were strong enough decks just with 30 cards, then they would potentially be able to carry the Renathal a little bit more than they are right now. I think it's just purely a metagame issue.
Yeah, I'm very skeptical. I think Reno Lock can be okay. I think it's not 42% win rate. Like it's better than that if you play a better version. But we are aiming for like high tier 4, low tier 3. Like that is the golden benchmark here, and that might be fine. Like, but I mean that's not exactly a great position for fans of these archetypes.
I'm going to continue to huff that hopium. I think there's something there when it comes to specifically Reno Lock. I think there's something there. I will be alone in that opinion, but yeah. All right, so we're going to wrap it up, a little bit of a shorter episode this week. Just kind of like last questions for you guys. How are you guys enjoying the meta? I know we've got a patch coming soon, TM. But you guys are good? You guys are okay with the how the meta's kind of shaping up and playing until then?
It's better than when Disco Lock was running rampant. So it could be worse. I had the realization just today on stream, actually, that like there's a variety in classes and decks being played, but not a variety in like strategy and archetypes being played, because it is so heavily aggro focused. It's just like a bunch of aggro decks and decks trying to beat aggro. So, like, again, why I play Wild is for the variety. Yeah, we get variety in classes, but not really variety in play style right now. And so that's maybe why it's wearing on me a little bit. But, yeah, it's still better than Disco Lock. But, like, if you combine all the aggro together, that makes essentially a Disco Lock, The difference is that I can play, some of the other 10 classes aside from the one that's dominating right now. So that's kind of where I'm at with it. It's been worse, but it's certainly been better as well. It's just kind of like it is. I think it's just the default Wild metagame. That, like Corb said, we went back to Sunken City. Yeah, that's the default Wild metagame. We're just in vanilla Wild territory right now.
Yeah, in terms of the composition, it's Voyage. It's what was the expansion before that? It's Alterac Valley. Like Alterac Valley was another format where there were a handful of slow decks like Mechathon, Warlock, and Shudder. But it was very like aggro-centric for the most part, and this is kind of what we sort of default back to. It's kind of hard. It's easy to forget, after the massive impact that Renathal had and how transformative it all was, to go back and be like, yeah, this is what Wild is, like a lot of the time. I don't hate it right now. I don't really mind this sort of being the default part of Wild. I think it's more that the current expansions made like a relatively low impact, which is a little bit surprising. But a lot of these decks that have been around are a bit samey compared to some of the changes that we've had previously. But in terms of play pattern, I don't despise it. Like, I'm not ever gonna get that pissed off that I queue into a Pirate Rogue. It's not gonna bother me that much. Like, there are worse things, but I am hoping that perhaps the mini set is able to give a little bit of a shake up, and maybe even some of the buffs that the team might be considering doing at some point soon.
Yeah, I was very doomer after the Renathal nerf, but it seems like things have shaken.
It's better than I thought it was
Yeah.
gonna be.
That's exactly what I was gonna say. It's like I was Doomer, but it looks like 4 weeks out. We've adjusted, and it seems like not terrible, right? Like I don't mind playing Wild, right? Like I'm not excited to play Wild because it feels like a lot of the cool stuff from the past like 6 months has been nerfed, and we talked about that a little bit, which is not cool, but yeah, just default Wild. It's all right. We've got a lot of decks out there. Yeah, like Roffle kind of mentioned, there are technically viable decks for every class, right? And you can hit Legend with any class, any of the deck, like better decks in those classes. But yeah,
Druid and Warrior would like a word with you.
Druid has Beast Druid. I think is actually low key very cool and good.
Cthulhu Druid's actually like
Yeah.
go play Cthulhu Druid.
Yeah. And then Warrior, just nobody, and Rage Warrior's a deck, just nobody wants to play it, and they never want to play it for like the past 6 months. So, but yeah, you guys down in the comments, let us know how you guys are feeling about the meta. Let us know what you guys are looking forward to for these changes that are supposedly coming, nerfs or buffs. Maybe next week, maybe.
Bro,
soon
I don't know
TM.
what I don't know what I'm gonna do when they nerf Miracle Rogue, man. That's like all I've been.
What you're
playing
gonna
for
do
2
is you're gonna play Miracle Rogue 3.0, and it's still gonna be broken, and you're gonna be fine. Okay. But yeah, let us know down.
You'll still have big ones to look forward to, hopefully.
Especially if they just nerf the Knolls, like you'll be fine, right? Like you can. There's the concoction deck that I've been playing with that runs like scabs and all of those things. So you just like pivot to that list instead of big Edwins. You just have infinite cocks and it'll be fine. True. Yeah, you're rogue, dude. After this past year, you can play whatever you want in rogue. It'd be fine. But yeah, that's gonna wrap it up for this week's episode. Thanks, guys, for joining me again and again. Let the people know where they can find you and your content.
Yeah, you can find me on both Twitch and YouTube at Roffle.
And you can find me at Corbett on Twitch and Corbettgames on Twitter and YouTube.
You guys can find me at Get Me Out on all those platforms. Appreciate all of you guys listening all the way to the end. You guys rock, and we will see you guys again next week. Later.